Hello, everyone. As Aaron said, my name is Stephen Fluin, and I lead developer relations for the Angular team. We did a lot of prep for this talk because one of my favorite things to do is to reflect all the things that I'm hearing when I have all these great conversations with people from across the whole ecosystem. Is I want to reflect those back to the community so you actually know what other people are thinking and dealing with and what the challenges are, because a lot of the things that we're each seeing are shared across all of us. And so it's a really, really good opportunity to do this. And it's a very unique medium. I heard from Aaron that there's a ton of people on the live stream. So I'm really glad to actually be here. As part of the prep, I did a few things. So first, I considered what sort of background I should have, whether I should be sitting on a beach, whether I should be drifting through the stars. But at the end of the day, I thought, let's just keep it enterprisey. Let's keep it professional with just a simple background. I also did one other piece of prep, which was I put up a little bit of a sign in my office here, super formal, so that my son and wife don't walk in on me. So hopefully that doesn't happen. Otherwise, we might have one of those news situations where my wife is like scrambling to grab my son. I have a confession. I used to think I understood enterprises. This was 10 years ago, and I thought to be enterprisey, you had to wear a suit and tie to work every day. And so this is a picture of me like 10 years ago. I realize now how dumb I looked and how mismatched that was to the expectations that people have and how misaligned that is with the kind of modern technology space. So I'm trying to always kind of forget that past and move on. So I have done a much better job since then in terms of learning to listen. And so one of my favorite things to do is to just listen and try and remove myself from every question I ask, remove myself from when people are telling me things and be like, stop being like, no, that's not right. Really trying to understand the perspectives that everyone brings with them. And so I wanted to get one perspective on business, which was I was going to put together a really great slide trying to integrate my son and the concept of business. And so I did a search for business in my Google Photos, and I got this really nice business photo. So that's my son with a cane. And that's as close as I came to a solid connection to the things we're talking about today. So I actually gave a very similar talk to this one last year at ng-conf. It was called Angular for Enterprise, and we covered a whole bunch of really, really important topics that were top of mind for everyone out in the world. So we covered things like mobile applications. Do I ship with Ionic? Do I ship with other technologies? How do we share components across teams? How do I build a hybrid application? What should I be doing about testing? What should I be doing about PWAs? How do I ship experiments? How do I stay up to date? How do I deal with build time? The good news is, because I already gave this talk last year, we have solved all of those problems, so no one's having any of those issues anymore. Yeah, I know that's not quite the case. But what we end up seeing is that even though lots of people are still working on those issues, those are still big issues across the ecosystem, the pain points that we hear about over time tend to shift. Things that are still a challenge for some folks end up not coming up as often in conversations. And we really see kind of two reasons for this. The first is that there are new industry trends. Right? The experiences that we're all delivering to our customers end up changing over time. If you look at coronavirus and the current situation the global economy is in, the way that businesses interact with their customers fundamentally changed. And now that's changing the way that we build these applications and the types of experiences that we're trying to deliver. And the other thing that ends up happening is that there's new technology trends. So the technologies that we're using end up changing and evolving and getting better, and the way that we use them ends up changing. And so I wanted to give a fresh talk based on the conversations I've had over the last 3 months, again, about the top concerns that folks have brought to us, which I'm actually a little bit surprised about some of these. And so the number one tip that has come out of a lot of my enterprise conversations, that this is really the only thing you need to remember about my talk, is that if you want to do bundle analysis, which you should be doing if you're trying to deliver great user experiences, is use Source Map Explorer. There's a bunch of other tools, like Webpack has a bundle analyzer, all those sorts of things. None of them do the job that you should be doing in terms of understanding what you're shipping out to production for your users. And in enterprise conversations, this was actually identified as one of the most valuable things that they had learned. And so make sure that you are using Source Map Explorer. So on to the more in-depth top 5 challenges that we've heard about from the ecosystem. The first is something called micro front-ends, which the fact that I've heard this term for years, but no one's ever talked about it and no one's ever brought it up is really, really interesting. And so we'll dig into that. Server-side rendering is a big topic. Mono repositories and code sharing are something that keeps coming back up as really important things to understand and discuss. We've got varied environments, because I know that not every company and every team out there is able to exclusively dictate across the company or team that you're going to be using Angular. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some of the business justifications, trying to deal with some of the questions that we get from other people when we work with on teams. So first, we're going to start off talking about micro front ends. And so micro front ends are a really weird term. And every time I talk to someone they're using the term a little bit differently. So whenever I talk about micro front ends, I always ask, what do you actually mean by that? Because it's a really cool concept that doesn't necessarily mean what we think it does in terms of Angular and other technologies. And so I want to kind of lay out what these applications tend to normally look like. So if you build a default kind of naive Angular application as a single page application, you are going to have a browser that's going to load an Angular application, a single kind of monolithic thing that's going to have all the features, visuals, and capabilities of your application. And if you're doing it a little bit better, then you're going to be doing it a little bit more like this, where you're going to have a browser loading a smaller Angular application, and then that Angular application is going to be intelligently loading the features, visuals, and capabilities that it needs as the user navigates about the application based on what the user is actually doing and based on what they care about. I've tried to boil it down to the essential, just in terms of separating all the different definitions, all the different implementations that people have for what a micro front end is for them, into kind of three benefits that I think a lot of web developers are looking for. First is fast initial load, right? We want great user experiences, especially if we're building something like an e-commerce website. We want seamless transitions. So as I move from my product details page into the cart, I want that to be fast, instant. I don't want anything getting in the way of that experience. And then the last one is actually one of the tougher challenges in computer science in general, and web development in general, which is this idea of independent deployability. If we had a bunch of different single page applications across our app, that would work fine, right? Everyone could deploy themselves. But when you start adding in those things like seamless transitions, that becomes a much harder challenge. And so let's actually talk about how we could answer some of those questions. So on the fast load, we actually have some really good answers. So as we see with every single Angular update, and we saw from Kara this morning, if you just stay up to date with Angular, we are going to continue pushing the state of the art and make your bundle sizes smaller, both in terms of the generated code, in terms of the size of Angular, but also in terms of the tooling that we offer via things like the CLI, where we are always looking for new strategies, new configurations that we can use to make your apps better without you having to change a single line of code. One of the cooler experiments out there right now is actually adding a roll-up pass into the sequence of events that happen as part of the bundling or the build, down leveling, minification, all those sorts of things. Doesn't work for everyone yet. That's why it's not default, but there's a lot of cool innovations going on here. And by staying up to date, you're going to be getting to take advantage of all those benefits. The other one that's really exciting and a lot of people are taking advantage of is server-side rendering. Because server-side rendering, in some way, whether that's a combination of pre-rendering or on request or some on request with caching, is a great way to deliver better user experience, especially in the perceived case where a user sees the products that they want to interact with faster. And if you're server-side rendering every single page of your application, in a way, if you're not bootstrapping the entire thing, you are taking one step towards a micro front end, right? You've got simple HTML and a small Angular application that just loads the parts of the app that you need to interact at that moment. If we talk more about seamless transitions, this is actually one of Angular's strengths, right? If you contrast a normal Angular application with a website where you have either a backend rendering or a single page application for every subset of features, Angular applications are very seamless, especially in the way that we can transition between routes. You can animate those things. We really, by taking control of the entire process, we can do a lot of really, really, really cool things. But when it comes to that third point, that independent deployability, that ends up becoming a fundamental issue because on the Angular team, at least, we're pushing folks towards monorepositories because it solves a whole bunch of different problems, from how do you test and how do you integrate all these different things. Because if I build an application and I want a subset of my application to be able to change at any time, I then have to make guarantees. I then have to make promises about how the subset that's changing and the rest of my application are going to continue working together. So it's a really hard challenge to guarantee this API compatibility between a small subset of the application that you want to redeploy kind of live. And you have to either find a way to subset the capabilities so you don't rely on everything Angular can do, for example, or you have to find a way to enforce those constraints. And one of the things that is really exciting is when you have an intelligent build system, you could theoretically know which parts of the application are changing and know, hey, even though I want to redeploy this subset of my application, I know that I'm breaking the compatibility with the main layer, or the main portal, and so maybe we have to redeploy both of those. You could independently create a intelligent chain. So all of these are the challenges that are kind of fundamental to this concept. But if you look at independent deployability, we don't actually have a fantastic answer. The answer today right now is use libraries. So if you're trying to ship application functionality that you want to change, you can do that. You can ship that library onto a private NPM. You can ship that into a monorepository, and you can change that library. But then the application author still has to be the one redeploying everything. So independent teams get a level of autonomy, but there's still a central level of coordination that has to happen. This is going to be changing in the future, we hope. So if you look towards tomorrow in the future, IV and dynamic imports are going to be a huge part of this, where as long as you can be guaranteeing the constraints and be guaranteeing the interaction between different parts of your application, you can do things like dynamic imports, where we can load code from the internet. The big challenges there that we don't have today are that right now, Webpack, for example, in order to resolve those dynamic imports, we have to know about everything at build time. And so this is an area that we're actively looking into and we hear about a lot. So the top second question that we get from enterprises and concern they have is around server-side rendering, because as we see that this is a lot of really good principles, a lot of great ways to build great user experiences, and I'm not going to talk about that at all. Minko on Friday is going to be talking about that as part of a talk that he's giving on the broader state of universal server-side rendering and deployment. The third issue that a lot of enterprises have brought up to us is this concept of monorepositories and code sharing, because when we talk about how Google does this, it sounds really exciting. But it's actually not that simple for a lot of teams, and they see a lot of frustration. And so I actually want to lay out the fact that it's a coordination problem fundamentally that we're trying to solve. And you can solve it either way. If you want to have a monorepository, that can help you solve this problem. But then when you're doing a monorepository, it solves the integration and collaboration part, but you actually have to worry about specificity and distribution. Whereas if you have many repositories, you actually then have to be the one worrying about integration. How do we make sure that everyone's using the same version of a library? How do we resolve differences there? How do we keep everyone moving forward together? But then you don't have to worry about the specificity and distribution problem. What I'll say is that it's definitely my perspective that tools and culture are easier to fix in the monorepository. And I'll give a few examples of that. So if you look at the Angular repository on GitHub, we actually are trying to embody this idea of a monorepository. So we have a packages folder with a bunch of different packages that are deployed to NPM. We have a third-party folder where we're pulling in third-party code. And GitHub is continuing to get better and better at this in terms of its code search, in terms of the ability to lay out project structure, even creating things like issue templates. You can actually subset those into it and have multiple different options for issue templates. And so this is a problem that's getting better and better. If you're using Bazel, I would say that that is not necessarily needed if you're at a small or medium or even many large scales. But as you get up to extra large scales where you're moving past maybe 50 libraries and applications and you start wanting to only rebuild the minimal subset that you need in order to build an application or build a library, Bazel can definitely help with that. And there's even tools that like the Angular team uses, like pull approve, that try and emulate some of the processes that you need, that a little bit of overhead that you need in order to manage that specificity and manage, hey, who can control which parts of the repo, who's involved in which parts of the monorepository. So I want to introduce the concept of a viral monorepository, because this is one of the things that I see growing up all around the place. So this is the concept that, hey, you want to use a monorepository, you see the benefits, you've heard us talk about it, but you're like, hey, no one else on my team is going for it, no one else in our company. There's no company directive to go and build a monorepository. So what should I do? And so the viral monorepository starts like this. You have a library team. Typically, this is led by the library team, but it doesn't have to be. And they say to one of the applications that's using them, hey, why don't you check your application into our repository? And the benefit to the application author by doing that is that they automatically get integration testing with the library. They get synced and they get locked into place with the library so that both move forward together, right? You make a change to the library, the integration test will immediately tell you if the application is incompatible, and you can fix them both at the same time. You can understand when changes are implicit or intentional and when they're implicit and accidental. And this is really, really powerful for the library. It's valuable. And then it also gives them better access to contributing back to the library, which is something that's really, really desirable, is for everyone to be collaborating. And then what happens is another application in your team or in your organization is going to see that you've done that. They're going to say, well, I want those benefits too. And so then they add themselves to the library. Now you've got two applications. Now you've got even better test coverage for the library and more cohesion between your applications in your ecosystem. And so everything gets to move forward together. So I apologize about the naming of viral repository. It's probably not the best timing, but if someone has a better name for it, please shout at me on Twitter, and we'll definitely change my slides. The fourth topic that I want to talk about from enterprises is varied environments, because as I mentioned before, we are not all using Angular all of the time, and this can be a challenge for a lot of us. If you reflect on how Google works, which is, I think, a really good model for agility and flexibility on teams, oftentimes Google is using great technology over fiat. So we're not going across Google and saying, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, right? We try and build great infrastructure that teams want to use because it adds value to their lives. So instead of pushing technology into people, we're creating pull demand through great technology. And there's a lot of good companies out there doing that. One of my favorite examples that I always talk about is VMware with their Clarity library. And what Google does is we give everyone very, very high autonomy, but at the same time, we value that collaboration across different groups. So even if you're using different technologies, even if you have an infrastructure piece that is not shared across everyone, collaborating across teams is super valuable. But getting down to more specific answers, varied environments end up being a big challenge, right? You have a team that's either using Angular or for some reason they're not using Angular, and you want these teams to be able to work together, collaborate, even if you're not dictating what technology they should be using. So I will say Angular is fantastic at the orchestration layer. If you look at a lot of the capabilities, a lot of the mindsets that go into building Angular, we are focused on this idea of how does one part of the application updating inform another part of the application, so that these things can be kept in sync, so that everything flows in a very logical, direct way, even through very disparate feature sets and very isolated feature sets. But if you want to actually be sharing at a lower level, we definitely have Angular elements. So you can create web components. There's this great library out there from Manfred called ngx build plus, where you can ship either a bunch of web components that share a version of Angular or independent web components, kind of self-bootstrap. If you are starting to get into teams that are building their own custom elements and you want to start consuming those, that can work really well for Leaf nodes as well, because Angular has really great support for web components. This is something that we're constantly looking at as standards evolve. We're actually trying to participate in a lot of those standards bodies, but there's some feature gap there. For example, Angular has directives where you can enrich existing elements with new functionality. And this is a really powerful way because you can take a component supplied by one team and add features and capabilities supplied by another team, or add take a component and add it into a a dialog box, things like that. So it's a very, very powerful thing. We also have things like form validation. Now, some of these features are coming to the custom element spec, so you now have form enrollment, form participation, but it doesn't have the same level of capabilities of Angular. And so always trying to consider where do we need compatibility and where should we be building Angular wrappers for these components and those sorts of things. One of the technologies that we got a lot of questions about is this idea of constructible style sheets, which is an emerging, really exciting part of the standard where you can actually have a style sheet that can be adopted into multiple shadow roots. So if you're using custom elements and you're using shadow roots, one of the challenges is you lose all of the styles. So you get perfect isolation, but you lose all of the shareability and all the composability of these large applications. And custom style sheets look like they might be an answer to that. Right now they have limited browser support, but this is a really exciting new technology that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. As Jeremy talked about earlier in his talk, Sass mixins and CSS variables end up being some of the better answers for collaboration in this space. So mixins can really easily add stylistic functionality across your application for standardization. And you can accomplish some of those same things with CSS variables or custom properties if you don't require browser support. Angular does not use CSS properties or really extensively because it doesn't have complete browser support natively, and you have to do polyfills, and that affects performance and things like that. All right, our last section here, business justification. So I just want to go through a couple of the major things that you can do to help talk to others in your organization about Angular. One of the hardest things that teams used to have was staying up to date. We still hear teams that find it difficult to justify to business stakeholders who don't really understand the technology staying up to date. But you can talk about the one version policy Google has and really focus on the idea of things like agility, security, performance. Staying up to date is absolutely the recommended path by the Angular team. We offer a long-term support for older versions, but we expect most teams to stay up to date. And if you look around the ecosystem, most people are doing it. Jules shared that as of the eve of version 9, most teams are on version 8, as far as we could tell. And so I think we're being very successful at making that path very, very simple for teams. The other thing that was really interesting in talking to enterprises this quarter was talking about this idea of usage tracking, where if you are a library author, you can actually track across your code repository. If you're moving towards a monorepository, or if you have kind of open source within your team, you can track usage of your components. You can analyze those sorts of things. And there's some teams out there that are working on tooling to actually allow you to do that. But the idea here is that if you understand how your components are being used and where they're being used, you can actually make sure you're investing in the most used components. You can use it to understand your customers. You can say, hey, why is everybody using this weird date range picker that we made as a one-off? Most people shouldn't be using that, so there's a problem there. And you can actually take it further to the extent of, we saw one company actually quantifying the value of their shared code. And so with every release of their shared library, they were saying, this is how many applications we just helped to stay up to date, to stay secure, to stay performant, to stay with the best experience. And they translated that into dollars. And I just thought that was a really, really cool concept of translating component usage and release dates into actual value for the business. So just to end up, if these challenges if didn't make sense to you, if you're experiencing other challenges, what should you actually do? So I definitely think you should be reaching out to our team. You should be filing an issue with bugs, with feature requests, those sorts of things. We want to hear. We are always listening. That's why we have the annual survey. That's why we do all these things in the community, is to actually listen and be part of the community. But the other thing you should do is kind of take ownership and try and build communities for yourself. Reach out to other people in your company, reach out to other people on your team, reach out to other people in your geographic region, reach out to people that you share common interests with, because community is what makes us all better. And it's only going to be that together, working together, that we're all going to win. Thank you so much.